Good evening or morning or afternoon, whenever you happen to watch this. It is right now 1:25 in the morning a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sunday, the 10th of July. And just wanted to share some quick thoughts. And I'm in a somewhat laconic mood. I had a nap this evening, hence I've always been a bit of a night owl. But at any rate, Um, speaking as someone who's been pretty much unplugged from the nightly broadcast newscasts for the past better than 10 years. It's been about 12 years since I've been a regular consumer of news. Prior to that, I was all over it. And now I can't remember. Well, when I do watch the news, I watched it a few months ago. What I'll do is I'll jump on to YouTube and I'll look at a broadcast of the national or global nightly news or NBC nightly news just to get a sense of what is out there. And today is such a day I decided to do that. Check out what's in the news, and I have a rather dim view of the journalistic ethics that exist in today's world. Um, I think Denzel Washington at a looked like a red carpet ceremony put it perfectly when he was quoted as saying, if you do not watch the news, if you don't watch the news, you're not informed. And if you do watch the news, then you are misinformed. I think calling it news programming is fitting because programming is about programming individuals the way you program a computer so that you get the desired results. So those behind the news programming have a desired result. There are certain things they want you thinking about. They'll tell you how to think about it and even how to feel about it. And I don't think that's healthy in a liberal democracy. But it is what it is. This is the world we live in. So the news that I saw being covered by CBC National News, that's Canada's government-owned national broadcaster, they talked about the Rogers outage, and it showed our incredible reliance on the internet for all aspects of our daily lives. And it's a scary notion what would happen in this world if, for whatever reason, if all of a sudden the internet was broken and could not be repaired. Could we go back to the analog age that existed, for a good chunk of my life up until, things didn't really start to digitalize until the mid late 80s. Um, and then the internet began in earnest back, I think, in the early 90s. I remember the first time I surfed the internet was sometime around 95, 96. Even 4 or 5 years later, by 2000, 2001, the internet was still very new. And I think that was the beginning of my tuning out of the news because I learned things that I've since been able to verify because I take a very dim view of anything over the internet, not a dim view, but a skeptical view. I'm going to give you some examples of some of the things I learned, and you can check these out yourself. Things that the news never covered that I would have liked to have known at the time. Now, most will remember it, most people my age, or in and around my age and older, will remember, of course, that Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States in 1980. He was the president. His vice president was George H.W. Bush, whose son then went on to become president in the year 2000. And Ronald Reagan was shot early in his presidency by a young lad by the name of John Hinckley Jr. And that's as much as I knew. That's as much as the news talked about in terms of John Hinckley Jr. He was a crazy kid with a filing cabinet full of mental health issues. Um, and he apparently, as I recall, was trying to impress Jodie Foster. He was trying to make himself famous because he was madly, deeply in love with Jodie Foster, the actress. Well, one thing I found out only thanks to the internet, I found out that John Hinckley Jr. was obviously the son of John Hinckley Sr. And who was John Hinckley Sr.? He was the president and CEO of Vanderbilt Energy and a close family friend of the Bush family, of the vice president, former CIA director George H.W. Bush. So that I don't ever recall seeing that being covered, that there was a close family connection between the man who shot the president of the United States and the vice president. This Hinckley family and the Bush family are tight. And that the news never covered that. Going down further, rabbit holes, if you will, found out that Prescott Bush, who was George H.W. Bush's father and George W. Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, back during World War II, he was a director at a bank in New York City that was shut down because they were involved in financial dealings with Nazi Germany. And after the U.S. entered the war, the bank was shut down. These are things the news didn't cover. Another thing the news didn't cover in 1980 was the Georgia Guidestones, which are now in the news. And most people didn't, if it hadn't been for the internet, I would not have known that this monument existed. I only found out about it sometime around 2000, 2001. And now, of course, if you brought up the Georgia Guidestones to anyone, because they haven't been programmed to think about it or consider it or even have knowledge of it by the nightly news, well, it doesn't exist. It's a conspiracy theory. Well, now that conspiracy theory, as everyone knows, it was even on NBC Nightly News. I was watching NBC Nightly News, the broadcast for July 8th or 9th, and they actually covered it. They didn't ask any of the questions I think should be asked, like how does someone get close enough to that monument with enough explosives to blow up a piece, one of the outer four stones, which is made of granite, one of the hardest materials known to man. It's even tougher than diamonds, apparently. Apparently, there's only one rock or one stone that's tougher, and that's something called quartzine, according to what I've read. How much explosives would you need to destroy it the way they did? That one stone crumbled and pieces, rubble all over the place. Because this is granite it was 6 meters tall and 0.49 meters, so half a meter in width. And someone or someones, we don't know how many people were involved. The way NBC Nightly News was reporting it, they seemed to suggest that it was a lone individual. Well, that's convenient because if it's more than one individual, then it is a criminal conspiracy, because obviously this is a crime. And that's another question that I have. Why was a crime scene demolished so quickly and bulldozed? It's a question, and I think a reasonable question. You would think they would block off the area, check and make sure it's secure, and then go about gathering evidence. You don't bulldoze a crime scene. But we're not supposed to be thinking along those lines. We're not supposed to be asking those questions. Just like all the way back in 1980, we weren't supposed to be asking if there was a connection between the man who shot Ronald Reagan and the man who would become president if Ronald Reagan had died. Uh, so just going through what the news did talk about and what we're being programmed to think. So they talked about jobs and the fact that Canada lost 40,000 jobs as of the most recent update, but our unemployment rate remains low at 4.9%. They talked about Twitter and Elon Musk and that soap opera. They talked about former Japanese President Shinzo Abe. I don't know whether he's president or prime minister. I don't know what their form of government is, but regardless, they talked about Tamara Lich, who's has been denied bail over her mischief. They talked about abortion in the United States, and everything in the wake of Roe v. Wade. With they're implying that the Supreme Court has gone rogue or something like that. And Biden was making a big deal over the fact that there was a 10-year-old girl who had to cross state lines in order to secure an abortion. And this is where the abortion issue gets difficult, because it's being presented by the nightly news as yes or no, right or wrong, good or bad, and you're either for choice or you're anti-abortion, and there's no middle ground. And they give you an extreme example of a 10-year-old girl uh, who I believe I'm not certain of this, but I believe they intimated that she was the victim of sexual violence and wanting to get an abortion. Now, I know that this is an incredibly contentious debate, not so much well, the Christian viewpoint is quite often presented as or life begins at conception. That's the popular Christian view, and I am absolutely 100% about Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And yet, when I read about a 10-year-old girl being violated and wanting to secure an abortion, I have a hard time. According to Scripture, we have choice. We are given free will. And while I would certainly applaud and be thrilled if the choice was made to carry the pregnancy through to, the creation of a new baby, I'm not willing to go so far as to say that I would require it. I would not. I'm not that extreme in my views. Unfortunately, that's the way the debate is being pushed. And you either have to be okay with abortions for any reason at any time, or never, no matter what. And those are two extremist views. Canada, and I've said this before, in Canada, we have no laws whatsoever. Most people aren't even aware of the fact that if you don't, if the decision is made that, oh, it's a girl, we don't want a girl, let's abort and try again, that happens in Canada, at least according to research conducted by the Canadian Medical Association. They looked at certain communities that are thought or believed to have a bias toward male children. And what their study did is they looked at families within these communities who already had a girl, and they wanted to find out what was the breakdown for second children, boy, girl. It should be roughly 50-50, slightly favoring boys. But what they found is that the evidence suggests, well, the evidence was points to the fact that there are just simply too many boys being born in that situation. And it even was more egregious if it was a family who had two girls. And then the numbers were even further out of whack, providing, and the Canadian Medical Association deemed that this provides strong evidence that there are individuals who are using sex selection, uh, using abortion to have the desired sex. So basically, what we're saying is that we value children, but not girls. And it's okay because it's choice. And I'm not okay with that either. So I'm not okay with denying a 10-year-old girl who's been violated the opportunity to choose to end the pregnancy. But at the same time, I'm not in favor of someone terminating an unborn child just because it's a girl. I find it curious and annoying that in Canada a number of years ago, a private member's bill, it wasn't even a bill, this was not a piece of legislation, a member of Stephen Harper's caucus put forward a, hey, Lumina Marks, and thank you for liking my videos. I feel like sometimes I'm talking into the void. But at any rate, a backbench MP put forward onto the legislative agenda. He wanted it to come to a vote. He wanted the Parliament of Canada to condemn the use of abortion to get rid of unborn girls. And Stephen Harper wouldn't allow it to come to a vote. It was removed from the legislative agenda, and that annoyed me. Because to me, if you're looking for the thin slim of the wedge that would open up the conversation about abortion, because every country in the world regulates it. Now the US has overturned Roe v. Wade, which means states can now put in legislation around abortion without it being deemed unconstitutional, which they couldn't before. Now, abortion is restricted. Certain limitations are placed on it in every country in the world except for Canada, Canada, North Korea, Vietnam, and China. Those are the only 4 countries in the world where an abortion is legal during the entire 9 months of pregnancy for any reason whatsoever, including if it's a girl and you want to get rid of it. But enough on abortion, and the most contentious topic on the face of the planet Earth, probably. So they talked about, this is CBC, the national news again, they were talking about British Columbia making 4th doses available. What I find interesting that so many news outlets refer to it as a second booster as opposed to a 4th dose. That strikes me as marketing. Four doses sounds like a lot. Second booster doesn't sound as bad. There's a story about a Canadian Olympic or swimmer who had been drugged. There was a bit on summer school. There was the tornado in Alberta, something about some local councilman wanting to make public transit free in Victoria, British Columbia. Then there was the human interest story, mandatory human interest story about a 14-year-old hockey phenom from Whitehorse. And then the Stampede Parade, which happened for the first time in 2 years, I guess. And that's the news that is being covered. They didn't even touch, not one bit. I'm going through. No, they did mention monkeypox. They did mention it. Canada's cases are now at 375. And I think monkeypox is going to be significant. I think it is. We're now globally at over 8,000 cases planet-wide, which is statistically insignificant at this point. We're a planet of almost 8 billion people, so 8,000 cases, it's a needle in the haystack at this point. But if you go back to the end of May 31st, they were only reporting 550. So the numbers have been growing, in that hockey stick fashion. And if they keep going at this rate, I think I did the math earlier. I think by the end of August, we'll be looking at 50, 60,000, which is still statistically insignificant. But as we get to the end of September, then we would be looking at hundreds of thousands, maybe 500,000. And by the end of the year, into the millions. If this growth rate continues, and it has been suggested that monkeypox normally undergoes 1 or 2 mutations every year. But what they have found is that from 2018 till now, so in the last 4 years or so, there have actually been somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 mutations. So exponentially more mutations than would be expected under normal circumstances. And so the line that's being put forward, or what the experts they allow to speak anyway, what the experts they're allowing to speak are saying is that this suggests that monkeypox may have been circulating and going undetected, and hence all the mutations. I haven't heard anyone yet talking about the potential for this to have been a manufactured virus, an engineered virus, gain of function research, which we all found out during the COVID era. And when COVID first came out, you weren't allowed to suggest that it had been created in the lab. I'm reading what Lumina is saying. They're working on making these things worse at places like Fort Detrick, and I'm not familiar with what you're talking about. But in terms of COVID, you weren't allowed to suggest that it came from a lab in Wuhan, China, which later, through congressional hearings with Senator Rand Paul and the public disclosure of Anthony Fauci's emails, we found out that the National Institutes of Health, which is that's Fauci's the head of the NIH, money had been funneled to that very same lab in Wuhan, China, to conduct research on coronaviruses. And there was a bone of contention over whether the work they were doing qualified, strictly speaking, as gain of function. Fort Detrick. Okay, I will look that up. Now, of course, now you can suggest it. Now many, even people who are allowed on the nightly news are allowed to speculate that yes, COVID could very well and likely did come from a lab. There was one Nobel Prize winning virologist who went public early in the pandemic, stating from his research that this has all the markings of a manipulated, engineered virus, and he was immediately censored, silenced, deplatformed, slandered. Turns out now a large chunk of the medical research community thinks that Nobel Prize winner was right. And if you don't know about whom I'm speaking, you might want to look into that, because he had some very other interesting things to say, which we're told are wrong. Just like they said he was wrong about it coming from a lab. Well, maybe he's right about some other things, because he's talking about the future, and no one knows what the future is bringing. Anyone who says something about the future is false, unless they have a crystal ball, they don't know. So I think monkeypox, I do think it's going to be real. And I do think it's going to spread beyond, I'll call it the homosexual community. I think it will spread beyond that. Viruses spread. It's what they do. You can try wearing a mask. which no one wears them right. If people would wear their masks right, maybe it would work, and that means you would have to wear a mask the way that an OR, an operating room doctor or medical professional wears a mask in theater, and that means you'd have to handle it in a sterile fashion. No one does that. People pull it out of their dirty, disgusting pocket. They touch the outside material all the time. Then they touch keypads, handrails, door handles, and everything. No gloves on. They're touching the outside material. Viruses spread. Cross contamination is everywhere. Um, your best defense, in my non-expert opinion, in a world filled with viruses, bacteria, germs, and pathogens, your best defense against them is a healthy immune system. But in today's world, the immune system is a conspiracy theory. So that was what CBC covered. I then watched Global just to see what they were talking about, and they talked about Boris Yeltsin resigning, or Boris Yeltsin, Boris Johnson, sorry, Prime Minister of Britain, resigning. Which there are a lot of things going on in the world right now. We got the Georgia Guidestones being blown up. We got the former Prime Minister of Japan being assassinated. We have Boris Johnson resigning. We had they talked about everything else. They talked about that Russian plane that's been grounded. They talked about Patrick Brown being disqualified from the conservative leadership. They talked, of course, about Ukraine and told you what to think about that and how to feel. They talked about the running of the bulls in Pamplona. Lumina is saying, and I did come across that, not on the nightly news. My wife is Tamil, so I'm aware of Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon, and their president is resigning. There's a lot happening in the world. And one of the things that's not getting a lot of coverage anymore is the fact that Finland and Sweden are looking to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that is incredibly significant because I look back historically and I look at, let's go back to World War One. And World War One, you had the Central Powers, which was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, what we typically now refer to as Germany. But in the months leading up, and maybe even a year or so leading up to the World War One, to the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which was the excuse to begin hostilities, like many. I think that they were building up toward war. There was an arms race going on, if you will, and everyone knew that a war was coming. They just needed an excuse. They needed a pretext to start it, and that was the assassination of the next in line to that throne. I forget whether it was Serbia. That's such an incredibly convoluted part of the world. But at any rate, his assassination started the war. But before the war even started, the Ottoman Empire, which no one ever talks about anymore, the Turkish Empire, if you like, they had been in negotiations with France, with Britain, with Germany, with the Russians even. They were looking for a dance partner because they knew that war was coming. And it was shortly after the war started that they signed on with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. That they went with the Central Powers, as they were called. And again, these are so many things that the news doesn't cover and that they don't teach you in history, but are verifiable facts. World War One was the first war when oil was a major commodity. You had tanks, you had airplanes, you needed oil, you needed gasoline more than any other previous conflict ever. on a global scale. And most of the world's proven reserves of oil were in the Middle East, which was the property which was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Now, something happened. The war started, World War One started in 1914, and within a year or so, it was at a stalemate. The Americans weren't involved, and the German side approached the British and wanted to sue for peace. They just said, let's have a truce, let's end hostilities. And the reporting I've seen indicates that Great Britain was inclined to accept the terms of peace, because basically it was everything goes back to the way it was. We had our little war, we killed a lot of people, we made a lot of people rich. Let's just go back to the old status quo. And a gentleman by the name of Rothschild approached the British Secretary of War, a gentleman by the name of Balfour, Balfour, and said, don't sign. We'll get the Americans on your side through our media interests. We'll bring the Americans onto your side. Now, prior to this, American sympathies had largely been with the Germans, because a lot of people of Germanic descent had emigrated over the previous 100 years or so. People had familial ties with Germany, and so American public will was, let's stay neutral, but if you force me to pick a side, they were leaning toward Germany. But Rothschild said, don't, we'll get the U.S. involved on your side. And Balfour said, or, the question was, well, okay, fair enough. You get the Americans involved. What do you want? What's the quid pro quo in this situation? And the quid pro quo was they signed something called the Balfour Declaration, and that stipulated that once the war was over and the Ottoman Empire, along with the Central Powers, had been defeated, then Great Britain would have charge over the Middle East, and Rothschild got them to sign what's called the Balfour Declaration, which stipulated that Great Britain would create a Jewish nation state in Palestine. And Britain reneged because they signed the declaration. All kinds of propaganda started flooding U.S. media outlets about the horrible Huns. That's when they started referring to the Germans as the Huns, bringing up images of Attila the Hun, and stories about German soldiers committing atrocities. This is as old as history itself. It's called atrocity propaganda. It's gone on forever. It happened during the first Persian Gulf War, when Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and a marketing company came up with the idea to have a young girl address a joint session of Congress in the United States in Washington, and she claimed that Iraqi soldiers were throwing babies out of incubators, something that no credible proof has ever been provided, and most historians now accept as just the normal atrocity propaganda. World War I, the press started telling stories about the horrible Huns, German soldiers cutting the hands off Belgian children, which is cringeworthy. And if you read it in the news, well, it has to be true. And this is the kind of thing, when news is designed to elicit an emotional response, you need to take a step back. Give me another example of news propaganda and how it works. During World War II, and I go off on wild tangents. I do not script anything. And these are just stream of consciousness, if you will. But in World War II, before Germany invaded Poland, what was the pretext? What was the reason? Did they just tell the German people, we're taking it? No. What happened was radio station, a German radio station on the German Polish border, was attacked by soldiers in Polish uniforms. Because Germany lost the war, because the Nazis were defeated, we now know that those soldiers were German soldiers who dressed up in Polish uniforms. But we only know that because Nazi Germany lost. The German people, of course, were told that a radio station, a German radio station on the Polish border, has just been attacked by Poland. And the German people reacted emotionally to that fact because it came from the news media. It came from, reputable, what they thought were honest, ethical, journalistic sources. They believed it, and it was a lie. They're not the only ones who lie. There are lies out there everywhere. So getting back to Finland and Sweden wanting to join NATO, just before World War I started, the Ottomans were in negotiations trying to find a dance partner because they knew a war was coming. In World War II, Poland was in months of negotiations with England for an alliance, which was eventually signed just before, a month or two before Germany invaded. Poland and Great Britain ratified an agreement. So, meaning, and it's a similar type agreement to what exists within NATO nations. In NATO nations, you've probably heard this, an attack on one is an attack on all. Well, that was the agreement between Poland and England, or Great Britain. If you attack one, you attack the other. So as soon as Germany attacked Poland, bound by their agreement, and they honored it, Britain declared war on Germany. I'm convinced that Hitler and the Nazis, that they were hoping that Britain would not honor their alliance with Poland, because Hitler's always, he wanted Lebensräuber, or whatever the German word is for elbow room, and he wanted to move east. He did not want to go west. But I think at the same time they were fully prepared for a declaration by Britain, and as we saw, they swept through Western Europe. But the point I'm getting at is that before World War I, before World War II, which were largely anticipated wars, there was, for lack of a better term, this seeking out of dance partners, the Ottomans with the Axis powers, Poland with Great Britain. And now, with the world seemingly, we've got, as Lumina has mentioned, Sri Lanka's president has resigned. We had the assassination of a former Japanese prime minister. We have Boris Johnson now resigning in Great Britain. And now we have Finland and Sweden looking to join NATO. Sweden, even during World War II, was neutral. And there have been allegations that have come out suggesting that the Swedes were sympathetic toward the Nazis. And I'll just go down, I'll end things off just talking a little bit about Nazi Germany, being a bit of a history buff. There's a tendency to believe that the Nazis were the brainchild of Adolf Hitler, like Mein Kampf, and that he was the brains and the muscle and everything behind it. The simple fact of the matter is that 2 or 3 years prior to the Nazis being elected in 1933, that party was bankrupt. They were in debt in today's dollars somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 million. Now, I invite anyone to look into this. And they were bailed out. And by whom? They were bailed out by the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation, which also helped found a prominent school on eugenics in Germany. And we all know what eugenic nightmare the Nazis had envisioned for their global new world order. And Hitler was the front man, but I'm convinced, editorial opinion, that he was very much a puppet on strings. And the people pulling those strings reached globally. If you know anything about this, I won't be the first one to say it, that there's talk that the Nazis had infiltrated the British Crown and Parliament. Henry Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford was a big fan of Hitler. He received the highest civilian award that Nazi Germany gave. Henry Ford bought a newspaper in Dearborn, Michigan called the Dearborn Independent, and he used it as a platform to publish his anti-Semitic screeds, which he then later bound into a book that was called The International Jew. You can go to your library, look it up. The Nazis had they were eugenics, this whole master race thing about picking and choosing who gets to reproduce, to improve the diversity and fitness level of the human race. That's right out of the Nazi playbook. It's right out of the German School on Eugenics that was founded or funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. This stuff is pure 100%. This is beyond evil. And which gets us back, doing a full, coming back to the start, the Georgia Guidestones. That's what they were about. Eugenics. Maintain global population below 500 million and manage human reproduction to improve fitness and diversity, manage the gene pool. Is this the type of world? This is the type of world the Georgia Guidestones envisioned. And we don't even know who built them. All we know is that an anonymous individual who used the pseudonym of R.C. Christian approached a company that builds granite monuments in Elberton, Georgia, which apparently is a granite hotbed. It's large quarries of granite. And approached them and said, with detailed blueprints on how to build a Stonehenge type structure designed to withstand a earthquake. That's what all the reporting on it said, is that these stones were built they were designed to withstand an earthquake, but they couldn't. Someone was able to get close enough with enough explosives to demolish one of the stones and damage the others. The capstone was partially blown, and yet no one's asking who. And they tore that thing down. I don't have any answers. I just have a ton of questions that no one is asking. Why was that crime scene bulldozed so fast? How many people were involved? Could there be a foreign government involved? And I'm just reading again what Lumina is saying. Lumia. They bulldozed it all and afterwards said no one can go on the property due to bomb risk. Well, why bulldoze so fast, ignoring bomb risk? I know it's contradictory. It's this whole era we've been living in for the past 2+ years. Is there's so much sucking and blowing going on at the same time? Going down the monkeypox. I mean, what's going to happen this fall? We already know that long established that respiratory viruses like influenzas circulate more during the colder fall and winter months. And right now they're saying we've got this BA4 and BA5. I think BA5 is the main one. They now say that this is leading to, in Canada where I live, where the temperatures are 70, 80 degrees every day now. So, and this is when respiratory viruses are basically, there's a little background transmission, but very little. Now they're saying that we're in a 7th wave. And then are monkeypox cases going to continue on this growth curve that they're on? They're on that hockey stick type curve. And with monkeypox, I tend to believe that the cases that are being reported right now are in fact genuine cases. I'm not talking about people who are asymptomatic, which is another word for healthy. Asymptomatic transmission, not going down that rabbit hole. But in terms of monkeypox, I genuinely believe that what is happening is individuals are experiencing, actually, they're sick. They have lesions, they're running a fever, they have all the symptomology of an illness. So they're going into the doctor. The healthcare professional looks and they go down the list and they say, this could be monkeypox. And they take a swab or whatever it is and send the material off to be tested. And 2-3 days later, they get the result back. But because this is a disease that currently is being reported that it's transmitting almost exclusively among men who have sex with men, I don't know what terms to use anymore, but I'm convinced that there are a lot of unreported cases out there, because not every guy who is gay is out of the closet, even in 2022, as celebrated as it is nowadays. There are some who are still in the closet. And to announce a monkeypox, to come out, for an individual to come out and say, I've been diagnosed with monkeypox, could almost out them. If someone, I grew up during this era. I grew up in the 80s and 70s, 80s, 90s, when homosexuality was taboo. And even though it's so much more open now, that doesn't mean that it's as open as we think. It's not 100%. There are still individuals who are in the closet. And I'm convinced there are people out there, there are guys out there who have monkeypox and even lesions, and they're just isolating at home and they don't want to be haloed, for lack of a better term. And so July 18th, from what I understand, the World Health Organization has a committee called the International Health Regulations Committee, IHR. They met previously on June 23rd. And one of the things they discussed was whether or not to declare monkeypox a global health emergency. The actual term is public health emergency of international concern. So that meeting was to determine whether or not to affix that label, to give monkeypox an official designation. And at that time, 3 days later, the meeting was on the Thursday. On the Saturday, they came out and they said that the decision had been made not to declare monkeypox a health emergency at this time. Well, they said we may revisit that at some point in the future. Well, already there are health professionals who are screaming on go onto Twitter or wherever, and or even the mainstream press, there are health officials bemoaning that decision. They're saying we need to get in front of it. We're dropping the ball. Blah 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 blah. And so they're meeting again. There's a meeting scheduled for July 18th of this same IHR committee, and I think at that point, we're talking it's the 10th now, so 8 days. I fully expect they're going to declare it that day or in the days following. Yes, indeed, monkeypox is a global health emergency. And the reason that the committee is called the International Health Regulations Committee. And if they declare a public health emergency of international concern, then member nations, those who are signed on to the World Health Organization, there are legal mandates involved. One of which is they basically have to follow the directions of the World Health Organization. So if the World Health Organization says you need to institute mandatory widespread testing, then we get widespread testing. And like we saw with COVID, I have no doubt people will line up. I'm a good person. I'm going to get my test. I want to make sure I'm being safe. And then with the PCR test, is there the potential for false positives? I'm not an expert. I defer to the experts. If you listen to Dr. Barbara Jaffe, who's the Associate Chief Medical Officer of Health for the province of Ontario, she, during a press conference with our Premier Doug Ford, outside of, I believe it was outside of a hospital here in Ontario, Canada, she stood in front of the mic and she said that, if you're testing in an area with very little COVID, you're going to get false positives almost half the time. That means the person may have something else, they may have nothing. That's what Dr. Barbara Jaffe said, Jaffe. You can find the video here on YouTube. It was reported on Global News. And would the same thing happen with monkeypox testing, with monkeypox PCR testing? My non-expert guess, yeah, of course. And then you have a case-demic. But I do genuinely think monkeypox is going to be 100% real, and that people are going to get sick. And I mean sick. I remember reading about Jack Nicklaus, famous golfer, winner of 18, I think it's 18 major Grand Slam major tournaments. Masters, I think he won it 6 times. Anyway, he's in his 80s now. And early in the pandemic, he tested positive, and so did his wife. And he said I forget who, but he said one of them had a mild dry cough and the other had nothing. Either Nicholas had the cough or his wife had the cough, but that was it. That was the extent of it. Healthy guy, 80 plus. And he said, nah, check it yourself. He said, nah, it was not a big deal. It did not make him sick. With monkeypox, I do think people will get seriously ill. I've read some of the stories about individuals who have come forward who have, was an article about a gentleman who referred to himself as queer. So I'll use that term. I'm quoting him. And saying he thought it was important to come out and mention it because to educate people, and he described it as lesions that are burning, painful, fever, sleepless nights, having to take enormous amounts of pain medication just in order to be able to sleep. This thing sounds nasty. Speaking as one, I got sick back in February. COVID, although I'm no diagnosis, so I can't say for 100% sure that that's what I had. But I'm 99% sure it was, in my non expert guess opinion. And I had headache. I spiked a fever and chills and muscle aches and pains and scratchy sore throat, dry cough, all the classic symptoms. But it was over in 2, 3 days, and it was no big deal. And if it wasn't for the fact that all this hyper focus on COVID, I probably would forget that I even had it back in February. I probably would have, it was a nothing burger. Monkeypox, though, I think that is going to be real. I don't think I'll get it, and not because I'm straight. I do think lots of people are going to get monkeypox regardless of their sexual orientation or regardless of their sexual activity or proclivities, I think is the way you say the word. Um, I think it's going to spread around like crazy. I think there are a lot of people out there with weakened immune systems that the reason I think I kicked COVID to the curb so easily is just because I have a decent immune system. God, thanks be to God, it's certainly not mine. Anyway, I've rambled on for almost an hour, and it's 2:21 in the morning, and while I had a nap, I am getting tired. So thank you for watching. Lumia, Marks, thanks for engaging. Appreciate the chat. Keeps me going. It makes me feel like I'm at least talking to somebody. And if you like it, subscribe. And then when I do these, you'll know. Anyway, talk to you later. Bye.